All right, you're back. So, let's talk about what made that presentation really good overall. So, the first thing is the introduction. I really like the introduction. It kind of poses a question for you and it almost flips the script on you. It tells you, hey, I'm a researcher who's been talking about the negative effects of stress for so long, but now I'm going to tell you why stress isn't bad. I think that introduction is good. It's kind of gets people on their toes a little bit, makes you think, well, wait, if this person's a stress researcher, why aren't they telling me about the negative effects of that if they're a health psychologist overall? So I thought the introduction was really good. And that's an important part of any scientific presentation because that is your first opportunity to make an impression with your audience. You want it to come across as very calm, very confident, but also you want to come back across as likable. I've been in presentations so many times with somebody who is a fantastic researcher, but they come across so boring in that first 1 minute of their presentation that I'm almost turning off immediately. If it's not a topic that I'm really, really interested in, that's going to be hard to get me back if you come across as really boring. That leads me to the second point right there, tone and speaking style. Dr. McGonigal in that lecture has a really kind of casual speaking style overall, but it flows very nicely. The style overall isn't overly scientific. She talks about a lot of science and brings up a lot of data, but she's not going through just kind of the X and Y axis and really making it boring along the way. She's using that information to kind of tell a story. Also, she has some great body language throughout the entire presentation. Once again, relaxed body language, using her hands a little bit to help emphasize certain points, but not going overboard with that. Using some motion on the stage as she's walking around. Ted does a really good job of facilitating this because of the stage that they give you and giving you that nice dot to stand on to kind of come back to as your home. But also she uses the stage nicely and doesn't get stuck to one place, doesn't start rocking back and forth, doesn't start pacing or anything like that. Just a very nice casual and relaxed body language as she's doing it. Next, I love the use of data. If you're trying to make a point, this is me in a nutshell. My wife gets always mad at me because she'll make a statement, and then I'll say, show me the data. And then she'll get upset, and then she'll show me the data, and then I'll learn that she was right. But in this presentation, it's fantastic because she kind of seamlessly weaves that data into her story to make a point. I'm going to make this point, and I'm going to use this study to make the point for me. And that's the most powerful type of point you can make in a scientific presentation overall. Next, slide formatting. If you looked at her slides during this presentation overall, they were simple. There was one with a picture of a heart on it, and that was it. Who was the presentation about? It was about her, Dr. McGonigal, the expert. So great. And lastly, the conclusion of that presentation I thought was almost flawless, and that she really wrapped things up very nicely, put a good bow on it, and kind of left you feeling, kind of all the warm fuzzies about it. And so I thought that was really good. So I wanted to use that as an opportunity for us to kind of start the lecture today to kind of talk about, what does a great presentation look like? Now, let's go through some of the nuts and bolts that'll hopefully make your next presentation a little bit more similar to that one. Okay, so first thing, if you're going to give a presentation in the first place, you got to prepare. You can't just whip it together like you did for your public speaking class, back in high school, all right? You need to prepare to give this talk. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to tell a story. And I talk about this a little bit with Dr. Munoz in our interview that you'll watch at the end. But what I like to do is start with my take-home message and work backwards. What does that mean? It means if you had to pick 1 or 2 or 3 things that person is going to leave this presentation with, what would that be? And if you identify those things up front, then you can start your presentation by kind of priming the pump. You can kind of leave some hints in there in the introduction to say, hey, I'm going to be telling you about X, Y, or Z. And then over the course of the presentation, you do it, and then they leave it and they say, oh, I just saw a presentation about X, Y, and Z. Okay? And that's the way you're going to kind of tell that story overall. Also, don't make it just about the data. Make it about what the data means. Even if you're really far down the line with a mechanistic a different pathway for heart failure, let's say, because I know that's what Dr. Bruns does. She's probably one of the most mechanistic people in our lab group right now. I am sure, and I've seen her give presentations, and she zooms out to start. Why is this important? How is this going to help us with our care of people who are at risk for heart failure? And then she zooms in and says, okay, well, if we're worried about heart failure, well, then we're worried about the heart. And if we're worried about the heart, then we're worried about the right atrium of the heart. And if we're worried about the right atrium of the heart, then and she zooms in and kind of gives you that really good picture. So once again, telling that story overall is what you want to start with. Not the story being, I did this study, and then these are the data, and this is the statistical differences. That's a really bad story. Nobody's going to read that one. Okay? Number 2, practice. This is a really, really hard one because I know with me, when I started with any presentation that I was giving for a scientific conference, I was so nervous about making mistakes during the presentation, and I put so much effort into making the slides and the kind of the script that I wanted to follow that I didn't want to practice because I almost didn't want to know if I was ready or not. And I also didn't want to get that feedback that, oh, that slide doesn't work, I have to change it all because I put so much work into it. But then I did that. I practiced one time and I got some feedback from that practice presentation, and then I nailed the presentation afterwards. I was like, why don't I do this? So you make sure that you do a practice run through of your entire presentation before you give it. Because if you don't, then you might potentially miss out on some areas where you could really make an impact. I know it's kind of overwhelming to think about giving that presentation one more time, especially if it's a longer one, but doing that full practice run is going to pay dividends, okay? Number 3, test. This depends on where you're going to be presenting, but let's say you're doing your master's thesis proposal, and you have chosen to give that presentation in a room that you don't normally present in. Let's say you go over to the College of Business because you're going to have so many people there, you got to have one of the big giant lecture halls for your proposal. Well, guess what? You should go there 1 day, 2 days beforehand and test exactly what you're going to do during the presentation. Do you have to run through the presentation from top to bottom? Not necessarily, but I'd put my slides on there to make sure that the formatting is good. Maybe they have a different size screen. Maybe you formatted yours in widescreen and they only have a standardized size screen. Well, now if you do that 2 days beforehand, you got time to go back to your house and reformat your slide to that size so it fits. I have seen probably 2 or 3 master's thesis defenses where the person gets to the location 10 minutes before their presentation, they get there, the computer's not working. Okay? So they call IT. Well, IT takes 5 to 10 minutes to get there. And they're trying to walk them through on the phone, and you're sitting there as an audience member at somebody's defense for their master's thesis for the first 10 minutes just watching them talk to IT on the phone. That doesn't start that presentation off in a very strong way. So test that out. Test out any equipment that you're going to be using. Okay? Also, another thing with testing is test your type of format. One big thing, and I think they're a little bit better now, that I saw during graduate school was a student who was a Mac user. And they made their entire presentation on the Mac version. What is that? The slide-based presentation for the software that they have for that. And they made their entire presentation on there, and then they got to the class, and it was one of our graduate courses, and they uploaded it onto the PC, and we saw the person get up there and said, okay, well, today I'm going to talk to you about physical activity. And we looked behind her, and there was just a big red X on the screen. All of the slides had not been able to transfer from Mac to PC, and then we just got big red X's for that. Luckily, our instructor was really nice, let her redo it the next week, but that's definitely not something that you want to happen when you're going to give a big scientific presentation at a conference. That doesn't usually happen too much anymore. There's a lot more ability of Mac and PC, but you want to check to make sure that your file format is correct. Some people also will use only PDFs because they know that that PDF is locked and there's nothing that can happen as far as format changing. Okay? Next, back up. All right. Always bring 2 versions of your presentation. Email it to yourself. Bring a thumb drive. Bring it on your actual computer. These are good things to do. I've seen there's conferences where you're supposed to email it to them beforehand. You email it to them, you get there, they're like, oh, we don't have access to that right here. Well, if you got it on a thumb drive, you can just load it up right there. Always bring 2 versions of your presentation with you, or two storage formats of it. Okay. The last one is the pointer. You want to bring your own, even if the site has one, and that's just in case. I've been to sites, I've been to give talks where the pointer they have isn't that great. Also, with my slide advancer, I'm used to using that. I'm not going to get caught up and pressing the button 10 times and it not working, and whatever's going to happen. I know that my pointer works and slide advancer works. I know that the laser looks okay, and that's what I bring with me because it's just that nice sense of security that I know what I'm getting into when I get there. So you bring your own pointer if you can, or use it as part of point number 3 right there and test that out beforehand to make sure that you know that it works. The worst thing that I've seen is like you're giving a presentation, you're out into the, standing in front of the audience, and then you have to walk back over to your computer and press the arrow key to move it on to the next slide. You don't want that. Okay? Next, that's the preparation. Now we're in during. What about the content? And this is something I stole from one of my really good friends' fathers who's in marketing. And he always said, when I'm doing a pitch, what I like to do is I like to tell the audience what I'm about to tell them. I'm going to tell you a story about how urine color is related to water intake. And then, in the middle of it, when you're presenting your methods and your results, you say, this is why urine color is related to your water intake overall. And here's some reasons and venues where we see that taking place. And then, at the very end of the presentation, you tell them what you just told them. You repeat that a third time. And that is why urine color is related to fluid intake. What this goes back to is the ability of that person to leave that presentation and say, oh, I just saw a presentation about how urine color is related to fluid intake. Okay? You've hammered that point home so many times that there is no way that they are not going to leave with that information retained. A little bit more of during. And this has to do kind of more with the slide format specifically. And these are some personal preferences, but I find that they don't really take away from your slides in general, and they can really help, especially if you're in a format where people are going to be asking questions. So the first one up here is to number your slides for reference. Let's move back one. And the reason that this is important is because a person may be watching your presentation, and you might have a super cool figure that you've worked on for a really long time, and it shows some very novel data, and it's kind of the main take-home. And then when you get back to your questions, so you've gone through the entire presentation, you get to the questions, and the person goes, oh, hey, can you go back to that slide with the figure? And you've just gone through your thesis defense, 50 slides, and you probably have 15 figures on there. And you're going to have to go back and press that back button until you get it. And you go, is this one? Oh, no, not this one. Okay, this one? No, not that one. Okay. And then if you had a number on the bottom, the person can say, can you go back to slide number 20? And then you can just go right there. It just makes it a little bit easier, and it keeps people kind of, understanding where they're going to be in terms of the timing of it. Okay. Number 2, second bullet point here. This is another personal preference for me. No outline slide unless your talk is really complicated. If you have a pretty general talk about one experiment or 2 experiments, you don't necessarily need an outline slide. You can verbally say that in your tell them what you're going to tell them. Today we are going to talk about my experiment that I did. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. Then we're going to move on to my methodology. We'll discuss the results in discussion, and then I'll give you some take-home messages. That's very easy to say without putting that bland slide up there that has those bullet points of what everybody knows is coming. But if you have a very complicated presentation, you might want to think about having a little bit of an outline up there beforehand. So that's not like an all the time thing. Last one, no question slide. This is another, Dr. J big pet peeve. What I like to do instead of having the question slide is insert my title slide one more time. Because everybody knows at the end of a scientific talk that you're going to ask questions if there's time allotted for it, if there's time, available if you didn't go over your time. Okay? But by putting that question slide up there, it just looks kind of chintzy to me. If you put your title slide up there again, what that does is it reminds everybody of the title of your talk overall, and hopefully you have a nice declarative title with the main finding of your study on it so people can really kind of once again see that description. Okay? And then also with having that up there, it reminds them of your name and where you're located, and maybe it has your email on it. So if they want to send you an email about a question, they have that information there for them as well. Instead of just questions with a question mark after it. Big no-no as far as Dr. J is concerned. If you see it with a really good presenter, I'm not going to make that mean that I'm going to walk out of the room, but I just think there's better ways to end a presentation than that blank questions. All right, font. 18 font minimum. That's where you want to start. Go up from there. It depends on what type of room you're going to be in, but especially think about presenting in the corporate conference room. With those small little flat screens there, you want to go even bigger. So if that's where you're presenting, maybe your thesis proposal or defense, you want to make sure that you check beforehand that font is good, especially if you're going to use a table or something like that. Next, you want to be sans serif. And what that means is it's the little kind of, we don't see like we would with Times New Roman, the little doohickeys coming off the end of the figures right there. We see this nice kind of clean font. This type of font, this sans serif, works better when it's visual. A serif font works better if it's going to be a lot of reading. So if you're reading a manuscript, serif is typically recommended for that. People have different personal preferences, but in general, if you're looking at a poster, that should be sans serif. If you're looking at a presentation, that should be sans serif. If you're doing a paper, it should be with. Okay? Also, no Comic Sans, ever. You never want to have Comic Sans font in any of your presentations. I've seen it before. If you went to Rocky Mountain ACSM a year ago, you saw almost a whole presentation by Dr. Len Kravitz that was like 100% Comic Sans, and I was just sitting there in my seat cringing. And I know a lot of other scientific researchers were doing the same thing. And yes, he had kind of a light and jovial presentation, but did I sit there thinking this guy's, just kind of a rinky-dink presenter? A little bit, because there's a lot of negative connotation with that font, so avoid that at all costs. In the conversation, the last bullet point here, you'll hear myself and Dr. Munoz talk about the benefits of dark font on a light background or light font on a dark background. And I like to kind of move towards dark font on a light background, but that kind of depends on the room that you're going to be presenting in. If you're going to be in a really bright room, having dark font on a light background isn't the best. If you're going to be in a very bright room, for example, if you're in a room with like a ton of windows, having a dark background with light font is a little bit easier because it stands out a little bit better, even when there's like sun shining directly on the presentation screen. So think about where you're going to be presenting. If you're going to be in a conference room, having that dark font and a light background is going to be fine, but just make sure you're consistent throughout. Don't flip halfway through. And the old adage, I don't know who came up with this one, but I think back in the late 90s when PowerPoint was first starting to come into use a little bit more prevalently at some of these scientific conferences, somebody said that a royal blue background with yellow font was the most attention-getting font and style. I still see that to this day at some presentations, and every time I see it, it once again makes me cringe. So don't do royal blue background with yellow font. It's a good contrast overall, but it just makes me think, oh, this presentation is from a slide deck that's 20 years old. That's generally what I think about when I see that. Okay, let's keep moving on here. During presenting the data, we want to keep this simple. Your manuscripts are, and some of your other types of presentation are when you can really dig into the weeds. You want to use data that tells your story. And this is really, really hard, especially if it's with a master's presentation, because you've probably done a heck of a lot more work and collected, 10 times the amount of variables than you're going to present. But you want to make sure that that data that you're showing there is going to tell your story and help tell your story. It doesn't matter too much if you're, telling about a variable that has no implications onto what your end, your take-home message is. You don't need that. Tell it with one data point and then move on, okay? Always, when you have a graph that you're showing, you need to identify the X and Y axis of the graph. You want to introduce your different groups, and you want to use animations to help to slow the introduction of information, because sometimes figures can be really overwhelming. So let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, So here's a figure. Oh, let me take that off for a minute. Here's a figure that I used at a presentation a long time ago. And we're talking about plasma glucose. And this was an international presentation at the Hydration for Health conference. And so on our x-axis, I would basically take my laser pointer and I'd run it along the x-axis there, and I'd say, on our x-axis, we have our time points for an oral glucose tolerance test. Okay? And then on our primary y-axis, we have our glucose in millimoles per liter. And because this was an international conference, I know that some other countries use milligrams per deciliter when they're presenting glucose. It's one of those weird variables that different countries use different kind of primary units. So I put those up there so that they were equivalent across the board. And basically what that allowed is people from different audiences to understand, okay, the data in the same sense. Then, with PowerPoint, there's a great function if you insert a figure where you can animate the actual data. So if I move forward, I show my first group of euhydrated, and you can see that if we slowly release that, you can show that data appearing one data at a time. So we've talked about, here's our first group. This is our subject population when they were euhydrated. You can see that we have a classical response to taking glucose in, and their glucose goes up over time, and it kind of peaks at the 90 minutes and then starts to go back down at 120. This is when they were euhydrated or had enough water to drink the day before. However, the same people, when they were dehydrated, let's see if it pops up here, or hypohydrated, had slightly higher glucose for all of those time points. So I encourage you, go into the settings on your animations, especially as far as a figure like this is concerned, and start working around with it to figure out how you change those settings. And actually, let's see if I can just show you right now. So if I press escape, and I bring this guy right over here, okay, let's do that. What you would do here is you'd want those animations and you'd want to see that animation pane. There we go. And here we are, our Chart 3 Series 1, Chart 3 Series 2, Chart 3 Series 3. And if we look at this, we can add an animation to it. And maybe we say fade for that. And the way you get to that with our Chart 3, hang on, is right in here. And you can see there's that little arrow, and you can go down, Effect Options. Within Effect Options, you can go to Chart Animation. As one object right there means that the whole chart is going to come in like a picture. But if you look at this, you can do by series, or you can do by category. And that's going to be different. Series are for our figures, these line graphs like this. Category would be if you had a bar graph with different categories along your x-axis, and you can have those bars come up one by one. So once again, if you cut and paste this figure from Microsoft Excel and paste it in there, or you insert it and you make it in PowerPoint itself, you have the option to let those data series come up one by one. And I think it's a really powerful way to slow people down and kind of let them see what's happening as we're going. Okay, so I'll go back to presentation mode now. And I got to swap these. All right. There we go. There we go. Let's move on. Here's a separate slide. This is going to be a bar graph. A little bit different. Let's say we want to be a little bit quicker. Okay? Once again, we have our different categories. We're going to have those come up just like that and appear. And then we have these happen one by one, where we have a little bit of a spaghetti graph where we show the individual data points for that person. Okay? That's plasma renin activity, and here is aldosterone for the same study. And we once again show the two figures, and then we can have those come in one at a time. Not too much color, but enough to show kind of a trend of what's happening. And overall, we can see, okay, yep, it looks like most people have an increase in their plasma renin activity, but there does not appear to be any sort of trend for people's aldosterone overall. Okay, so just another way to kind of release that data to help you tell your story without just having it up there as a static figure. Okay. The one last caveat I'll leave with, don't overdo it. It gets very easy to kind of go overboard with some of these animations. And I know I've talked to you about animating different things before, like your protocol schematics, but especially with this, don't go too wild with it. 1 or 2 slides max. don't make it like a theme for your entire presentation. Next one, tables. Okay, we talked about some figures. What about tables? Number one, this might as well be the only rule. Do not cut and paste from a PDF. Everybody right now is squinting at their screen looking at this. Now you are sitting about a foot away from your screen. Imagine if you're in the back of a giant conference room and I put this table up there. Okay? The reason you don't want to do that, it's going to be blurry. Even if it's big enough, it's probably going to be a little bit more blurry. It shows too much information. Let's go back. If you are ever giving a presentation that needs all of these different variables to tell your story, you are in trouble. And you're better off breaking that up and not showing the entire table on one. Okay? The other thing is, and this is kind of a separate point, is it shows a lack of attention to detail. What this tells me as an audience member when I see a presentation with a cut and pasted table is this person just cut that, put it right in there, and moved on. They didn't care enough about what this table is saying to want to reformat it because the data is all right there. So what do? Well, make a new table to highlight the pertinent information. Okay, here we are. We're making a table just about urine osmolality before and after an intervention, and we have it in two different groups, high drinkers and low drinkers. Here's pre, here's post. That's the most important part that I want to take from this giant table here. Well, I'm not going to just show that whole table. I'm going to just show that part right there. And very easy to cut and paste, or not to cut and paste, to look at that data and put it into a new table, and you can format it so that that table formatting is consistent throughout the entire thing. You can put a nice little reference at the bottom of your slide if you want to let readers know, hey, this comes from table 1 in Johnson et al. 2015, whatever. That's important to do, but it just makes it a lot more pleasing to the eye when you see only the information you need. Well, what happens if you do need a good amount of data in a table? Well, okay, so I need to know about this euhydrated and hypohydrated group. Once again, I need to know about how much water they were prescribed, what their body mass was, what their urine osmolality was, what their plasma osmolality was, and what about their plasma volume change. These are all separate topics that I want to touch upon in my presentation. Well, there's a better way to give this presentation than just putting this table up here, okay? Let's see if it'll work. One way is to put little boxes, okay? And you can use these to kind of draw people's eyes to the areas you want to go to. This is good, especially if you only want to talk about one thing. Hey, I'm going to talk about water prescription right now. And look, the euhydrated group is at 3.5 liters a day, and the hypohydrated group was about 0.8 liters a day. And then you can add these different boxes in as you go to move down like so. But the way that I really like to do it is a little bit different. I like to put, and you can kind of see the little boxes that I've put in there that are the same color as the back of the table. And what I will then do after that table is there is I will animate these different boxes to slide down. Okay, you can have them slide out of screen. So when I'm ready to move on from water prescription, I can then move that box. And now we see body mass. And now we see urine osmolality. And now we see plasma osmolality. And now we see plasma volume. What this does is it gives a very kind of subtle animation to draw the kind of audience's eye to the point you are talking about right then. That kind of red box has been a little bit overused. That was one of the first things that came out when people started doing that with some tables. But now I think that this way is a little bit better overall. And in fact, Alec, who's done a couple of our videos before, is working on a video for us right now that's going to show you a third way to do it, in which you can actually, the problem with tables is you can't animate individual cells. So even if I highlighted the text, 3.5 here, and went to my animations tab and said add animation, it wouldn't only animate that 3.5, it would animate all the text in the entire table. But Alec has figured out a way to turn each cell into an individual object as far as PowerPoint's concerned. And then you can animate that object. It doesn't look at it as text anymore. It's just an object. And he's going to give us a video for Excel number 3 that teaches us how to do that. But for right now, there's two ways that I would go with. Number one, add those red boxes, and number two, you're going to use these kind of blank boxes that go down as you go. So let's finish it off. Last part of the little lecture right here. After answering questions, really, this is a make or break part of your presentation overall, because then this will be the point of the presentation where the audience members go, is this somebody who just memorized a presentation, or is this somebody who actually knows and can defend their data? First, repeat that question to make sure that you understand it. Okay, you can do that pretty quickly. It's also really nice in a place where the question asker might not have a microphone, to make sure that the entire audience knows what question you're about to answer. Then you want to thank the person for the question. Hey, that's a really good question. Thanks a lot. That puts you on a really nice terms, even though the question might be a little bit accusatory. Hey, did you do a correction for multiple comparisons when you did all those t-tests? And then you say, oh yeah, I apologize, I forgot to mention that during my presentation. Yes, we actually did. Take a seat, buddy. All right. Then keep the answers short. I've seen this happen where people get kind of brought into a thought process while they're answering a question, and you can tell they're trying to kind of fish for the answer. Sometimes you need to get a little bit more elaborative when you're answering a question, but in general, keep that answer as short as you can, because you want to make sure that if you have 5 minutes for questions at the end of a presentation, everybody who wants to ask a question can. That's going to really show some coming out of that presentation overall. In line with thanking the question answers, don't be arrogant or hostile when you're answering questions. This is not the place to do this. And in fact, in most of science, there's really no benefit to this at all, ever. Okay? So you don't need to, if a person is accusatory or kind of, a little bit hostile towards you when they're asking the question, totally reflect that. Do not go back. Don't stoop to their level. Answer it in a very polite and respectful manner, no matter how the person comes at you. I've seen people get very flustered up there, and that does not leave a good taste. Even if you're right, you don't want to go down that road. Okay. Our third to last bullet point there. What if you don't know the answer? Oh my gosh. This is something that happens to me all the time when I'm teaching undergrad ex-phys. I'd say every other class, a student asks me a question that I don't know the answer to. So obviously I just BS something, and then, I'm out of there in 5 minutes anyways. They'll never know the difference. No, that's not what you want to do, especially if you're giving a scientific presentation, because I guarantee there is somebody in that room who knows the answer to the question that you don't know the answer to. So if you answer it and give the wrong answer, somebody's probably going to call you out. Fess up. That's the best thing to do. Oh, you know what? I don't know the answer to that one. Would you mind if we met up after this and kind of exchanged emails so I could get back in touch with you and after I look into it? Maybe it's somebody else helped with the data collection and you don't know the intricacies of the methodologies that person is asking a question about. You didn't necessarily take that measurement. You're just presenting the data. And that person wants to know if the person used this type of scalpel or that type of scalpel when they were doing the surgery, okay? And you don't know. Don't make something up and say, oh, well, we usually use this type, so it's probably that one. Don't say that. Say, you know what, I'm going to check into that and let you know. That's something that's important, okay? It shows really, really a good kind of command, and, people will know when you're making stuff up. I have what if you don't know the answer twice. So last one, should you plant a ringer? This is a nice one every once in a while. One benefit of this, and what I mean by a ringer, is put somebody in the audience who's going to ask a question that you've rehearsed an answer to. This can go well. It can go bad. The reason that I would advocate for this in certain circumstances is if you're really nervous. If you are very, very nervous about answering questions about your research study or whatever it is you're presenting about, having a friendly face ask a question that you know the answer to first can really set a nice stage for you. So I wouldn't necessarily, it's not a necessity. You don't need to have this, but I find this as one way to kind of mitigate a little bit of the stress that goes along with some of these scientific presentations. That pretty much does it for my presentation on how to give a presentation. So let me describe to you what I want you guys to do for this week's assignment. This is a part one of a two-part assignment. I want you to go back into your slide decks from yesteryear. Go back to freshman year, find that presentation you did, 20 minutes before it was due for a certain class. That's what I want to see. You're going to use the VidGrid or the Flipgrid website again, just like you did with Excel exercise number 1, and you're going to make a quick 5 to 10 minute video for me with these slides next to you. So you'll have the slides in the background. You can put your little picture down there at the bottom as part of it, and all I want you to do is really kind of walk me through this presentation. This was a presentation I gave about X, Y, and Z. This was the class I gave it for. This is what I'm trying to get across. The second part of what you're going to want to do in this week's presentation is tell me the things that you notice about it that are really bad. Now, with all the information that you've gotten over the years, why is this slide deck bad? What about these slides are really, really, not up to standard? Okay? So that's part one. Then we're going to take a couple week break, and then what I'm going to have everybody do is re-present as if you're presenting this again with better slides. So you're going to turn in the old bad slides, and then I'm going to see the new good slides in an actual presentation. Does this have to be a scientific presentation? Absolutely not. If it does happen to be a scientific presentation, you got to step up, because we've talked about some of the things that make or break good scientific presentations here, but it does not have to be. It could be about a totally different topic. So just find a really bad slide deck, go through, identify 5 to 10 things in there that you want to make better. Now knowing what you do about slide presentations in general. And then in a couple weeks, I'm going to have you come back and actually give that presentation a second time, but with better slides. And then at the end of that last presentation, you will tell me what you did to make this better. Okay? So you don't have to make all new slides for this week. All you have to do is find an old slide deck and walk me through what it is and why it's bad. Okay? So with that, we'll leave it for today. I think the assignments for this week are due on Sunday. So make sure you take plenty of time. If you need extra time for anything, please let me know. We're at the point in the semester, especially with moving from on-campus to off-campus. Even though this is an online class, I know that people are dealing with a lot of different stressors right now. So if you need extra time for any of the assignments, for whatever reason it is, please get in touch. The only reason I have due dates right now is to make sure that we kind of keep on track and to evenly disperse the workload. But those are very fluid as things come up. If you have to take care of family members or anything else like that, please get in touch. I don't want this class to be a big stressor for you. I want it to be applicable knowledge that you can use to help you in your career. Okay? See you guys next week. And don't forget to watch part number 4, which is my interview with another great scientist about what she thinks are some of the best parts of prepping for, giving, and after a scientific presentation. Thanks. See you next week.